Welcome everyone. Today we will discuss student progress reports and the IE and NA designations. We will talk about the difference between assessment benchmarks and proficiency benchmarks, the number of assessments needed to increase benchmarks, student progress reports and the IE designation, read-only skills in the student progress reports, student progress reports and the NA designation, and student progress reports with both IE and NA designations. Let's look at the difference between assessment benchmarks and proficiency benchmarks. Assessment benchmarks are assigned by a language assessor, and they cannot be confirmed by an instructor. In this example, you can see that the student only has assessment benchmarks. There are no proficiency benchmarks listed. Proficiency benchmarks are assigned by an instructor after all required assessments have been completed. It is important to remember that instructors can only teach CLB +1. In this example, the student has assessment benchmarks assigned by a language assessor and proficiency benchmarks assigned by an instructor. How many assessments does the student need to successfully complete to increase their benchmarks? A student will need to complete 4 successful PBLA-based assessments in each competency in order for the instructor to increase a benchmark for a skill. In this example, the student benchmarks are 5, 4, 4, 5. In order to increase the benchmarks, the instructor will have to teach and assess CLB +1, in this case 6, 5, 5, 6. The student will need to successfully complete 16 assessments to increase all benchmarks. To be eligible for a benchmark certificate, the student will need to successfully complete 8 assessments in total, 4 assessments for listening and 4 assessments for speaking. If a student has only assessment benchmarks, IE must be selected in the SPR if there are not enough successful artifacts to demonstrate learning in the portfolio. Please note that instructors can enter achievements for any skills with an IE designation to record work completed, even if CLB +1 cannot be assigned. Instructors can update individual benchmarks, CLB +1 and IE, even if not all skills were successfully assessed by the SPR deadline. In this example, the student only has assessment benchmarks. The only benchmarks updated to CLB +1 were for listening and speaking. The current benchmarks are now a combination of CLB +1 and IE. If a student has proficiency benchmarks, IE is not used. In this example, the student has proficiency benchmarks 7756. Therefore, the current benchmarks will show as 7756. For this student, only reading can be updated to CLB +1. When a student has proficiency benchmarks of CLB 6 or higher for one skill or more, this will show as read-only in the SPR. In this example, the student's proficiency benchmarks are 7756. Listening, speaking, and writing will show as read-only in the SPR. Reading is the only skill for which benchmarks can be updated. Once reading benchmarks are updated, the current benchmarks will show as 7766 and the student's status will change to graduate plus withdraw. Let's move on to NA designations. As of July 16, Link Home Study cannot teach skills with benchmarks 6 or higher. NA is automatically assigned to skills with assessment benchmarks 6 or higher in the SPR. NA appears in student benchmark profile and benchmark certificate for applicable skills. NA is not used for skills with proficiency benchmarks 6 or higher. These benchmarks are read-only. When a student has assessment benchmarks of CLB6 or higher, NA will show for current benchmarks in the student progress report. Skills with assessment benchmarks of CLB6 and higher cannot be taught and assessed. In this example, the student has assessment benchmarks CLB6 for listening and speaking, and therefore listening and speaking cannot be taught and will appear as NA. If the student has proficiency benchmarks CLB6 or higher, NA is not used and the benchmarks will show as read-only in the SPR. Achievements cannot be submitted for any skills CLB6 or higher. When the student only has assessment benchmarks CLB6 or higher, this will show as NA in the SPR. In the first example, the student has the following benchmarks: listening 6, speaking 6, reading 4, and writing 4. Current benchmarks for listening and speaking will show as NA. Instructors cannot submit any achievements for listening and speaking. In the second example, the student has proficiency benchmarks of 6, 5, 6, 4. Listening and reading will show as read-only and no achievements can be submitted for listening and reading. Student progress reports can have both IE and NA designations. In this example, the student has only assessment benchmarks 7765. The current benchmarks will show as NA, 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 IE. Only one skill can be taught, writing, and CLB6 is the highest benchmark that can be assigned. Once CLB6 is assigned for writing, the student status will change to graduate plus withdraw. And that is all for IE and NA designations in student progress reports.